All right, good morning. So we're in the middle of our series, Cradle to Grave. We're doing a sort of an overview study over the life and ministry of Jesus. And over the past few weeks, Pastor Eric and Pastor Brandon have been sort of at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. We're going to take a really big jump this morning and go sort of towards what we would consider maybe getting near the end of Jesus' ministry, and that's strategic. But if you are saying, hey, there's a lot of details in there I'd like to know about that you're skipping maybe, we did a series a few years ago called The Gospel of John, which explores all of that and elaborates on all that. So you can check that out on YouTube. That'll fill in some of those details. But we're going to jump to Matthew 17. So if you want to turn there, and the reason that I want to go here is because I feel like this is sort of the hinge point of the life and ministry of Jesus with regard to where the focus is and ultimately the direction that he's heading. Because after this, we're going to see Jesus and his disciples turn and head back towards Jerusalem, ultimately to fulfill what we know as the Passion narrative. Hey, Eric, can you bump me down just a little bit? Thanks, man. And so that's where we're going to be. But as I was working through and figuring out what part of Jesus' life and ministry I wanted to talk with you guys about, I remembered sort of the summer of my freshman year of college. Now, some of the students, you may have heard some of this story, but my freshman year, that summer, I hit the jackpot as far as a summer job. I got to work with an organization called Christian Adventure. I don't know how many of you guys are aware or know that. At that time, they were based out of Camp Caraway, which is not far from here. But basically, what they were going to do, they were going to pay me and one other guy, and we were going to take youth groups out for week-long backpacking trips on the Appalachian Trail. You know, we did some discipling, some mentoring, and we taught them how to rock climb and rappel. It was great. That was like the dream job for me. I grew up in the foothills and lived on a farm, so mountains and hiking and hunting and being in the woods, that was all commonplace to me. I really enjoyed that immensely. And, you know, it's kind of like, all right, so how many of you guys work in Charlotte or all right, so if you're in Charlotte, you can immediately tell the people who are from Charlotte versus the tourists, right? Right, because the people in Charlotte, they're like, oh, yeah, this is a normal day, and the tourists are like, wow, check out these big buildings, and look, this street only goes one way, right? Everything is new, and it's, so I say that to say the area I was in, it wasn't really all that new to me. It was something I was familiar with. But one day we're backpacking and we walk out on this clearing, and I had been in this clearing before, but this is the scenery we walked out to. Now, granted, this picture was taken like 10 years ago on like one of the little rolls, so it doesn't really do it justice. But I walked down and I stood there and I sort of felt like this new sense of being overwhelmed. Because as I stood there for the first time, I thought, this seems to go forever. And it's just this overwhelming beauty. And I began to understand some things about God and how big he was and how powerful he was and who he was standing here. And so that summer for me was very transformative in that I really connected with God in a very different way. I began to understand and begin to see him in a very different way. Now you're probably thinking, what on earth does this have to do with this passage? Well, because I think Jesus and his disciples, they're going to hike up a mountain, and I think they're going to have a very similar experience. They're going to be going about normal, everyday things in a setting that was pretty familiar to them, and yet in a moment, they're going to see and understand Jesus in a very different way because of what they see when they reach the top of the mountain. So these three disciples, they're Peter, James, and John. They're going up this mountain. And I think we need to discover in this passage 4 things I think the disciples learned. And so we're going to hop in and we're going to go start in chapter 17, verse 1. It says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. All right, so after 6 days means roughly a week later. A week after what? Because if somebody tells you a story and they're saying, so a week later, you're like, well, a week later from what? Well, in Matthew 16, we've just seen Peter step up and say, "You are the Son of God, Jesus, you're the Christ." And then in basically the same conversation, then get called Satan. So a lot's happened. So a week after that, that's where we are. It says, "And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, it's good we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah.' And he was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him.' When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, 'Rise and have no fear.' And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, 'Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead.' And the disciples asked him, 'Why did the scribes say that Elijah must come first?' And he answered, 'Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands.' And the disciples understood he was speaking to them of John the Baptist." So these 3 disciples, they get a glimpse of the glory of Jesus Christ. They get to see just a little bit of heaven. And so I want to rest in that idea, the glory of Jesus. Now, your notes probably say the 4 glories of the Christ. Now, just to clarify, most of us, I think, probably think that Christ was Jesus' last name. Christ is a title that means the Messiah. So the Christ is appropriate. Just to clarify, so, like my last name is Starnes. It's not quite the same. But I think there's 4 aspects of the glory of Christ that we need to look at and then pull out and apply to our lives. And so that's the direction I want to head this morning. And so if you're taking notes in the app or on a piece of paper, your first point this morning that you really want to write down is the radiant glory of the Christ. Now, again, if you're a visitor, I'm the student pastor, so I get a little more leeway since I work with teenagers. What does the word transfigured mean? And if you have a student near you, go ahead and ask them. I'm really comfortable with awkward silence. So anybody, take a guess. What does transfigured mean? Okay, changed. Yeah. That's exactly right. It's a change. It comes from the Greek word, and I totally butchered this in first service. Metamorphao. Yeah, that's how you say it. The reason that matters is because it's where we get our word metamorphosis. It's not simply an external reflection, but rather it's a change that begins on the inside and then it displays itself on the outside. It's a holistic change. If you want something that maybe can illustrate that for you, can think of a butterfly. Caterpillar changes fundamentally, turns to goo inside of a cocoon and comes out completely different. It's that kind of change. And why does that matter? Well, because the glory we see here is not a reflection from anything, but rather it radiates from within Jesus. It is the true nature of who Jesus is that the disciples glimpse, that they see. And I think that we miss out on that sometimes. We miss the true glory of Jesus. And I think it's really interesting that in Matthew 16, Peter has believed. Then he confesses that Jesus is the Son of God. Then he sees the glory of God. Because for us, so often, we want that to work the other way. We want to see the affirmation before we're willing to believe or confess. And we've got that backwards. In fact, multiple times in the gospel, Jesus tells people, you've been healed because of your belief. What you're seeing, these miracles, are a result of your belief. Yes, it can produce belief as well, but it's a result. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to travel on a mission trip, specifically more often to third world countries in my experience, but Miracles occur there all the time because they believe. They're not waiting to see. Rather, they believe and they receive affirmation. And when you begin to see the glory of Christ, that's when you become transfigured yourself. That's why it's so important to grasp that idea. I asked Dylan and the worship team to do that song, Glory to Glory, this morning. Romans 12, 1-2 says you're transfigured by the renewing of your mind. I can remember at summer camp when they first started playing that song. Kids are jamming out, and if you ever get the opportunity to go to summer camp with us, you should definitely go. It's phenomenal. But one of the things I love about working with teenagers is you don't have to guess what they're thinking. And so our students are sitting there and they're like, what does that mean? I'm not going to sing for you because I make a joyful noise that's only joyful to God. But, glory to glory to glory. They're singing this, and they're like, I don't get it. My guess is most of us sitting out here would say the same thing. I don't get it, but we don't want to risk looking like we don't get it. And it's this idea, it's this really big word called sanctification. It's a process by which you are moving from yourself to look more like Jesus. That's this process of glory to glory to glory. As you receive and you see that glory, it begins to change who you are internally, and then that glory begins to reflect outwardly as you look more like God, and then ultimately you experience Jesus in his fullness of glory in eternity. It's this process. There's a lot packed into that. I mean, we could spend all morning just talking about that. But unfortunately, they only gave me 40 minutes, so I have to keep moving. I think the important thing is it's this process of seeing God rightly through the Holy Spirit. And then, as we see that, we're transformed into that image with which God created us before the fall. It's that moving from that point of salvation into that growth. And the only way we can do that is through seeing clearly the radiant glory of Jesus Christ. So how would I boil that down? Study the Word and see the Son, right? Because John 1:1 tells us Jesus is the Word. As we do those two things, we'll be sanctified by the Spirit and ultimately will reflect the splendor of the Father. So that brings me to our second thing this morning. If you're taking notes on the app, you'll notice there's several more verses under each point. That's just for you to have extra references about what we're talking about. So, but the second point this morning that I think we need to pull out is the reigning glory of Christ. There's several instances where we see these three disciples, Peter, James, and John, pulled out with Jesus. And they go off and they do something separate from the larger group. Now, if you know a little bit about church history, you'll know that Peter, James, and John eventually become the early fathers of the church. So you can look back and knowing some of that knowledge, you can say, oh, that makes sense. He's mentoring them. He's grooming them. And I think that's some of it. But I find it really interesting if you start to dive into moments where those disciples were along with Jesus. Was there a common theme there? The answer is yes. The common theme is that Jesus is victorious over death. His kingdom will reign. How do I know that? Because in Luke 8:51, we see one of those instances, and what does Jesus do? He raises the daughter of Jairus from death to life. What else do we see? The Transfiguration, this story, it reveals his glory, but only momentarily, because he's going to emphasize as they come down the mountain that he must die before he is returned to glory. He will be victorious. And then we see it again in Matthew 26:37 in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's praying to the Father, and the three disciples are there closer to him, and he's praying about his impending sacrifice. He's teaching them that his kingdom will rule forever. Because if you ask people, what are you afraid of? The top two answers you get, public speaking and dying. I think Jerry Seinfeld said that means you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. I think he said that one time. But those are the two things. And so Jesus is saying, my kingdom, my glory will reign over the thing you are most afraid of. We talked a little bit about, so our student ministry has taken a little bit of a turn over the last year. Not like a bad turn, a negative turn, but we had a focus where we were dealing topically and we were talking about cultural issues, and we still do that on occasion. But at the start of this school year, we stepped back and said, hey, I think our students need something different. And so we began a series where we study the nature of God. And we study different aspects of who he is. And so we sort of start to see, because ultimately what we decided was if our students can know God more, the application will follow. Right? If I'm teaching you that God is love, I can teach you application out of that once you understand that God is love. And all of that funnels back into the glory of Christ. I find it very interesting that Moses and Elijah show up here. Right? These weren't just guys hanging out in heaven, had time to drop in for a coffee break. They're very intentional because Moses here represents the entirety of the law. And Elijah's here representing the prophets. So what is the message that we're hearing? That both the Old Testament and the prophets are pointing to Jesus. That's what the message we're hearing. See, I think sometimes, don't hear me say that the New Testament is bad, okay, in what I'm about to say. But I think a lot of times our churches get really hung up in only teaching in the New Testament. And we think, well, the Old Testament, yeah, that's old, so we don't really. What is the purpose of the New Testament? The purpose of the New Testament is to convince you, especially the Gospels, that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, how do we know anything about the Messiah? Because the entire Old Testament describes who he will be. So you want to know who the Messiah is and what he is like? Old Testament. Then all the Gospel writers say, hey, look, you see all this stuff back here? That's Jesus. All of it points to him. And so we see and we begin to understand that the promised glorious kingdom, all the way back to Abraham, is fulfilled in Jesus. That's the kingdom that will reign. It wasn't just like, oh, one day God had a good idea and here comes. That was always in the works. All the way back. It's going to reign forever. And I love what Peter says, right? He's like, listen, Jesus, this is awesome. Let's build some houses. Let's just stay up here. To me, that's pretty logical. I mean, you're already standing, fundamentally previewing what heaven is going to be like. He's like, let's put down a Taco Bell. Everybody will show up. It's going to be great. They will know who you are. It's perfect. To me, that seems like a really good idea. But then God pops in, and what does he say at the very end of his statement? He says, listen, hear him. I think it's interesting that standing in front of Jesus in his full glory, the command is not to see him, but to listen to him. Really runs kind of countercultural because, you know, Pastor Eric even talked about it last week. In our world, seeing is believing. But I have lived long enough to know that what I always see may not be true. I don't know how many of you guys have seen the TV show. I think it's called Penn and Teller. Anybody seen that? That's a really great show, by the way. You should check it out. So Penn and Teller are really famous, not musicians, magicians. And what they do in this show is they have upcoming, practicing magicians come on, and they perform a trick. And the challenge is to fool two of the greatest magicians in the world. And if you can fool them, then you get to go and perform at one of their shows in Vegas. So they perform these tricks, and then Penn and Teller start talking, and I don't understand anything they say, and then all of a sudden the other magician's like, oh, yep, you figured it out, right? I love magic. I love to watch it. But you know what I also know? What I see is not actually what's happening. So a lot of times, we miss that it says, hear what I'm saying. It's a message Peter caught pretty well. He emphasizes it later in 1 Peter. So, I guess that brought me to the question, is seeing really believing? Because if we're honest, it feels like, looking around, maybe Jesus' kingdom really isn't in charge. I think people make the case for that all the time because we're seeing things. But what we have forgotten is that he said he's ruling spiritually now, and one day he will return to rule physically on the earth. Seeing's not always believing. So that brings us to the third aspect of the glory of Christ that I think we need to pull out, and that is the redeeming glory of Christ. Anybody else find it interesting that they caught a glimpse of heaven but then realized it was going to have to go through the cross before that would be permanent? Here's just a taste of what it's like, but this is what it has to go through. I mentioned that in our students, we're pulling back and doing some different stuff. And so in February, like normal, we did a series on relationships and sex. Followed up with that was a little awkward of a transition because we did a series on God's judgment. Right? You think, wait a minute. That's a little, but here's the thing. It gave me an opportunity to contradict this idea that God's love and God's judgment are separate things. Because God is perfectly loved, but God is also perfectly righteous. And you're saying, well, how do those things work? And what I had the students do is to think about what is the perfect judge. The perfect judge has to punish injustice. So that means all of us. He has to punish sin. And so we all think in our own individual case that, well, it would be great if God could just let us off the hook. Well, that's not perfect justice, is it? Because if he lets you off the hook, then what's to say he can't let Adolf Hitler off the hook? See, so really, in reality, we need God to be perfectly righteous, even though personally we don't really want him to be. And we'll get to how that all ties in with love in just a second. But the students were they were having a hard time wrapping their mind around that, as you can imagine. And so I presented to them, how many of you guys know what an ethical dilemma is? Okay, if you don't know it by the name, you probably will recognize it. So just imagine that your spouse or child or parent, somebody is really sick. But there's a medicine that can heal them. Without this medicine, they're going to die. Let's say the medicine costs $5,000 a dose, but it only costs the pharmacist $500 to make each dose. So you scrounge up, try to get, and you get about $2,000, $2,500, somewhere in that range. And so you go to the pharmacist, and you try to negotiate, and he's not interested in a payment plan or giving it to you cheaper or any of that. So the question I pose to our students is, would you steal the medicine? Now, teenagers are pretty candid. They're like, yep, I'm doing it. Which probably is the response that most of you have. Because you're thinking, well, the ends justify the means. It's not really that big of a deal. But what has happened is your character is now different. You're no longer an honest person. And so you're left with a choice to either impinge upon your own character or to allow those that you love to die. You kind of making the connection now, right? God, in his perfect character, cannot allow us off the hook. And so, because his love is perfect, he sent his son, Jesus, to bear and pay that price. That way, God's righteous anger and judgment against sin can be satisfied, and yet he can still demonstrate his perfect love by providing a way for our redemption back into a relationship with Him. The redeeming glory of Christ. I don't know if anybody's ever told you, Jesus came to the world to die for you. Everything else is just proof that He is who He said He is. That's why He came. His entire purpose is in that. And I think part of the message there is that redemption comes through suffering. In fact, there's a passage in Isaiah 53, and some of you may recognize it when I say that. It's called the suffering servant. Let me see if I can summarize that for you real quickly. So the suffering servant is one sent on a mission from God. Secondly, his mission involves suffering on the behalf of another. Third, although he will suffer and be rejected, he will in the end be exalted and vindicated. And finally, his suffering will bring justice, salvation, and blessing to all the nations. Man, if that doesn't sound like Jesus, I don't know who else it is. In fact, in Matthew chapter 8, Matthew basically goes, this guy that you know about from Isaiah, that's Jesus. This is His purpose. This is who He is. He's living it out right in front of you. You can't have glory. You can't have the redemption without the suffering of Jesus. It's not possible. They're not able to be separated. In fact, a lot of scholars suggest this idea of death as an exodus comes from this passage. Death not as a destination, but rather as a journey. And we got into this a little bit with our students, and some of them had like mind-blowing moments where we talked about what happens when you die. And so everybody, physically, your heart stops beating, all that. And so that's physical death. I said, and so that's what they're, and I said, what about spiritually? What happens spiritually when you die? You're going one of two places. There's no waiting room. You're either going to experience an eternal spiritual life or an eternal spiritual death of suffering. That's it. And that decision has to be made well before. Why or what does this purchase us, for us? Well, let's use a word that's so very important for America. Freedom. Purchases us freedom. Freedom into a renewed life, a different life. Listen, if you have ever had any family member, or maybe you yourself served in the military, you know the only thing about freedom that's free is actually the word. It costs a great deal. And if we can understand that politically, why can't we get it spiritually? We have been purchased from a worldly system that never could save us, a vain and empty life, addiction, sin, dare I say it, ourselves. And all of that came through the suffering of Jesus Christ on the cross. I think it's not insignificant that all three of these disciples would learn that lesson. Again, if you know anything about church history, Peter was crucified upside down. Why upside down? Because he refused to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus, because he wasn't worthy. John's beheaded. If I'm remembering correctly, I think he may be the first church father to be martyred. I think that story is actually in Acts 14, roughly. And then John, he actually got it the best, I guess. He was exiled to a deserted island, where he then wrote the Revelation. They learned very quickly that suffering and glory go hand in hand. Suffering and the message of Jesus go hand in hand. And so that brings us to sort of my final point I'd like to bring out this morning, and that is the resigning glory of the Christ. Now, when I say resign, I don't want you to hear like negative overtones or sort of this for submission, basically. Now, if I'm honest, I'm probably a little bit more like Peter than I would like to admit. Because if we read through the stories, Peter is often found arguing with everybody, even Jesus. And I like to argue with people. Any of you who know me well know that I will debate you, even if I don't agree with the position I'm debating. It's just part of my personality. I realize that's weird. My wife hates it. So you can sympathize and pray for her if you would like. But Peter, on multiple accounts, even argues with Jesus about Jesus dying. He's like, that is not happening. He's like, we will throw down before that happens. And then he does, right? He cuts off a guy's ear. He's a man of his word, at least, I guess. But what Peter didn't understand is that this glory was never going to be taken by force. That the only way that this was going to work was through the submission to God's plan and Jesus' death on the cross. And the same message is true of us today. The best way that we can glorify Jesus is to deny ourselves and take up our cross. To love people and preach the gospel. And I realize that message is completely opposite to anything that probably makes sense to us. Because the message that makes sense would be to save yourself. Just, again, I'll put it like I put to my students. You can't. I don't care what you do. I don't care how good you are. I don't care how much money you give to church, how often you're at church. I don't care how many times you share the gospel a week. You cannot save yourself. Period. End of conversation. The message is you must yield yourself to the gift of salvation and to Jesus Christ as Lord. I don't think it's coincidence that when the disciples looked up from being afraid, what does Matthew say? They saw Jesus only. Now, Matthew is written to a very Jewish audience who would have understood the sacrificial system and the legal code and how to do everything the right way. We see those two examples here, and at the end, Matthew is saying, all of that doesn't work. The only answer is Jesus. Period. Moses, Elijah, nothing. None of it works. You must submit to Jesus. I mean, we just talked about the fact that all of that points to Jesus anyway. He's saying, hey, here it is, and you're missing it. And what encourages me the most about this passage, I think, is the fact that in this submission, we see that God's plan will be fulfilled. God's plan has always been Jesus only, and it doesn't matter who tries to get in the way. I've often heard in more like my school circles and stuff, Christianity referred to as the great paradox religion. Because everything that you assume and everything that you think would be normal, it's the opposite, right? The Bible teaches to be great, I must become the least. I must serve. To experience glory, I have to suffer. So to get the best thing in my life, I have to experience some very difficult things. Or how about the fundamental one? To live, I have to die. And yet this is exactly the message of the glory of Christ. To experience salvation, to see the glory of Christ, you must submit. You must be saved. So I like to do this thing with students. I like to try and summarize everything into one sentence. And this is a lot to get in one sentence, but what would I say? Jesus is the glorious Son of God. He is the Christ and the Messiah promised from the Old Testament, come to suffer and die for your sin, to restore you through the process of sanctification to the full image of God, culminating into a glorious eternity worshiping in heaven. The glory of Jesus. The question is, are we going to see it in the correct way? Are we going to understand the message that was communicated? If you're a visitor, your first time, I don't know if you've ever heard what I'm about to say, but if you come to New Life, you hear it every week. But we're going to say it again. The message of the glory of Christ is that you were born a sinner. You cannot save yourself. The rightful penalty for that sin is death and an eternity apart from the Creator who made you. The only way to fix that broken relationship is through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You must accept the gift of salvation, but also accept Jesus Christ as your Lord. That's it. Call it intolerant, call it whatever you want, but that's the truth. And that is the glory of Jesus Christ. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, God, I come to you, God, and it's my prayer that maybe for the first time today, someone has seen you as you truly are. They have seen your glory. God, for those of us who don't know you both as Savior and Lord, I pray that today would be that day. God, that we would recognize our sin, we would understand the penalty, we would see the payment, and ultimately enter back into that broken relationship with you. God, for the rest of us, I pray that as Paul indicates, God, that we're moving from our moment of salvation and we're maturing, that we're not staying small children in you, but rather, God, we're moving from glory to glory to glory, that we're in that process of sanctification. And as we get to know you more, God, that internal change reflects outwardly to the world. God, I pray as we go this week that we would preach the message of the gospel to everyone that we encounter. In your name we pray. Amen. You guys have a great afternoon.